guys, welcome to the Foodie Book Club. This month we've been reading The Good Life, which is by Helen and Scott Nearing. It's actually two books in one. So the first one is called The Good Life, and the second one, which starts about halfway through, is called Continuing the Good Life, and that's a little bit more about their homestead in Vermont. I really enjoyed the book and I love the idea of being self-sufficient, and every time I looked up books about self-sufficiency, this book always came up. It's kind of considered like the Bible, the go-to book for a homesteading and living off the grid and being self-sufficient, starting from absolutely nothing and building from the ground up, which is really good. It's really interesting, but I did struggle a little bit with it. I quite like the books that are a bit biographical, which I guess this one is, but it's also very much could be used as a manual. It gives very specific details in it. So they build their own houses from stone and they quarry the stone themselves and they haul it back to their farm, and it actually gives you like dimensions and step by step to build all of these buildings. And I'm quite a visual person and there aren't really any pictures of the process as it's going on, so it was just a lot of numbers and instructions, and I found myself getting a little bit lost in those parts of it. But the gardening parts were really interesting, and I did find myself highlighting some bits about how they grew certain crops, so that was something that I could look at myself and continue. We moved house this month, so I was a little bit out of my reading routine. I usually read for around an hour in the evening, and once I got back settled into my routine, it felt like it was a bit of a slog to come back to this book. I was like, oh, shall I read something else? I really wanted to stick with it because there's a lot of useful information in it, but as I said, it's a bit more of a manual and one that you would probably want to dip in and out of. It can be a bit dry, I think, in places for reading like big chunks of it. But I'm really glad that I read it, because now when people talk about their best self-sufficiency book to read, I know that I can come from a place the same as them because I've read it too. It's interesting following the couple's journey. So they start off living in the city, which is definitely a theme with these books. It kind of starts out like, oh, you don't need to have any money already, but then they do buy a farm, which that's how these books always seem to start off, but people make their money in the city first. They're academics, so they've been teaching and they're quite well educated, and they move out to Vermont. They start off with quite a small farm and they buy a couple of the farms closer by. One thing I found really interesting was how they scheduled their day. So they only did 4 hours of work a day, and they called that bread labour. So that was the things that they had to do to be able to survive and to develop their farm, and then they spent the rest of the day on any other pursuits that they had there. That was like their free time, and they were quite structured with that, which I really liked, because that's something that I try to do. I have to work because I have bills and things to pay, but I wouldn't want to be one of those people who's like a slave to the wage. I just want it to earn enough money to pay all of my bills and then have time to do my own thing, which was something that they were quite specific about doing. And they said that when they had guests who came to stay with them, and interestingly, when they did have guests, the guests were expected to, you know, chip in and help out with the work, that a lot of the guests found it hard to adapt to their routine and weren't so used to having that much free time in the day. They also made most of their money through sugaring, quite similar to The Dirty Life that I read. They had the maple trees in that one, so it was quite interesting to see that was somebody else who was using that method and getting a lot of money from the syrup that comes from the trees. But they were very explicit about not having any livestock, because that was such a bind, such a tie to the property. They enjoyed doing things away from the farm, and the livestock was a big tie to it. So they were only really tied there during the season when they would get in the syrup, and the rest of the time they could travel around. And definitely later on in their life they did a lot of teaching, and they travelled all over the world telling people about how they had become self-sufficient, which was really interesting. It would have been an interesting thing to go to one of their talks, especially when you've got someone who's actually done it from scratch. And I can't imagine anything better than having a home that you've actually quarried the stone for and put it all together. So it was a really interesting book, but it was just a little bit dry in places, and I did feel sometimes it was losing my interest, mainly because there was so much detail, and I don't know if that was really necessary. There is a second book that they have written. Well, they've written quite a few books, but there's another book that's specifically about setting up a sugaring business and running it yourself from scratch, which I can imagine you would need that kind of detail in a book like that, because it would be then the absolute manual for setting something, for setting up the sugaring business. But I just don't think in this, I would have liked some things it could have backed off a little bit and not quite so much detail. But having said that, it's a good book and it's definitely worth a read, but maybe read something else at the same time so you can just dip in and out of this one. I'd love to know what you thought about it. I don't think I've given away too many spoilers. It's not really one that's got lots of plot twists in it anyway. But next month I decided to go for a book that I'm thinking will be a bit of a lighter read, and that's Raymond Blanc's biography, and it's called A Taste of My Life. I recently watched the TV series that he did, and I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to find out more about how he works with the head gardener to get the produce into his kitchen. And I'm quite interested to learn about his story of becoming a chef as well, which hopefully is all in there. So if you'd like to join in with the book club next month, that's the book that we're going to be reading. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye! So one of the things that drew me in almost straight away in the first few pages of the book were these really lavish, amazing descriptions of the food that they're cooking.